Hello and welcome to we've done our welcome and introductions, and we're going to go next into starting with why, which will be this idea of, why get into a project like this, and we'll hear from some of our panelists. We'll go through the publishing process in some depth, uh, starting with, where do you start? How do you get started? The question of writing solo or with a co-author or a larger group, as well as selecting a publisher. We'll move from there to time management, thinking about everything from starting with why to the actual publication and looking on Amazon to see your book, and working out a timeline. And from there, we'll give you all an opportunity to ask some questions to our panelists. All right, so let's jump right in with our first poll question here. And so we want to hear from y'all on this one, and you should see that pop up in just a second. And the first question is, do you plan to write a book? And we'll give you just a few seconds there to respond. All right, so let's see. So we've got about 61% saying yes, this would be my first. So that's great. You were certainly in a similar boat as many of us were when we first jumped into that book project a few years ago. And so, particularly this group here, all of the books that were published in the last 5 years. In fact, and 2 of them in the last year or this year, and Barbara's book, I believe, last year. And so, some of us were very much new to these processes. As well. And so we'll definitely share some of those, ideas, and some of our, experiences with you. And so, it's so important to have that why, as I shared a little bit. And when I was introducing myself, when Kathy reached out to me, 2 years ago and said, I've got this idea for this book project. And she said, hey, I think that I talked to some of my colleagues and they said, you might have a similar idea. You might be the one that I should choose here, to embark on this crazy journey. And I said, you know what, I've been thinking about a book almost in the exact same way. And so we had a great conversation, and our why was increasing, the capacity for leadership educators to do their work. We wanted all of those things, all of those resources that we wish we had when we got started as leadership educators. So myself more in kind of a faculty role working in academic affairs, and Kathy is a little bit more so coming from a student affairs background and working in professional areas that way. And we knew that we wanted to know more about the history of leadership education and programs. How do you develop courses, and what are some great exemplar programs and both in the curricular and co-curricular side that we wish that we had examples of when we were doing our work, as well as how do you do assessment, everybody's favorite thing, and what does this learning leadership process look like, and what are some examples and some processes with respect to teaching and learning in the classroom. I wish that I had resources for how to do this stuff, best practices. And so we embarked on that journey. So that was, most definitely our why. So I'd love to hear from some of our other folks too. So let's start with Barbara here on the bottom left. So Barbara, what was your why? What was kind of your perspective for jumping into your book project?
Well, I started working on the book probably maybe 8 years before, something like that, and it really grew out of my sense over the years that so many people get assigned to teach about leadership and don't really have much of a background in leadership. I mean, that's changed a lot, I think, because now we have so many a number of doctoral programs in leadership studies. But when I first got started in this work, most of the people that taught about leadership were somehow being called upon by their dean to take on that assignment without much background. And so I wanted to provide something for the person who may not have much experience with leadership, but a good bit with teaching. And also for newcomers who could benefit from newcomers to the whole academic world who might benefit from having some guidance. And I also wanted to, speak to people that weren't necessarily academics, but who were called upon to sort through all of these, pitches about the latest, greatest leadership approach, and help them think about, what are the more solid theories and research backing for particular methodologies and so on. So that was a lot of what drove me, and also the effort to think in an integrative way, this blend that focuses on the person and what the person cares about, group development onto organizational and societal levels.
Great. Thank you so much, Barbara. And let's see, moving left to right on the screen. So Kathy, anything you'd add to the story I shared?
Oh, Dan, you said it great. I think it's so important with the why. So I would echo, all of the whys that you said, but I think more importantly for me was that why was what kept me going, right? Whenever I was getting up at 4 a.m. or doing some crazy time just because I was trying to fit it all in, how that why I kept going back to that, and how is that going to make contribute knowledge or contribute to the field of leadership education. And so the why for me was, how are we, much like Barbara mentioned, how are we integrating and doing it not only in the classroom teaching leadership, but for other populations as well. And there was a huge gap. And so again, that gap, and Dan, what you said, hoping and wishing we had that, right? Instead of fumbling through, but something that I could take and digest. And so, but more that why was critical for me when I was starting to get low energy on some things, that I could say, oh, wait, why am I doing this again? Ah, yes. And then I was able to get that energy back. So a lot of what you said, Dan, absolutely.
Great, thank you. All right, and again, left to right on the screen. So I'm gonna jump to Sadhana here, because I know we're gonna hear from Gama in just a moment. So Sadhana, what was kind of your perspective there with respect to the why?
So I think that my experience in working outside of academia really informed why I wanted to participate in developing leadership programs. And it was just phenomenal that we were able to pull together a whole bunch of programs, and they worked well. And I really, really, really wanted to share the lessons learned that I had learned, so that people could just adjust, adapt, or do what they wanted to with the leadership programs. So I was excited about doing that. And to yours, Kathy and Dan's point, it was really to add to the knowledge and say, my goodness, people are practicing these things, and hopefully they will also be able to practice and develop something that works for them.
That's great. Thank you. All right, and Yao.
Okay, sorry for the voice, a little hoarse here. But when I was chair of an organizational leadership program, what I found was many of my teachers were not connecting with their students. And for me, it was really important that there was a connection, not only for customer service, but the real personal development was happening in the leadership classroom. So a lot of the book is not only sharing of my experiences, but how a teacher or a leader or anyone can really develop those skills that puts you in touch with your audience. Who are you leading? Why are you leading them? What's your vision? How do you know when things are going right? How do you know when they're going wrong? We've all had times where things definitely go wrong. So I wanted to share those too, try as we might. So this is what the book is about, is how to develop those leadership skills for you in the classroom.
Excellent. Yeah, and as Simon Sinek says, we got to start somewhere, and might as well start with why. So, all right. So we're going to move on to our second polling question here. And so, do you plan to write solo with at least one co-author or an edited volume. And I'll put this poll up here for y'all. Okay. Most of y'all coming in. About 5 more seconds. Right. Let's see if I can share these results with everybody. There we go.
Mm.
Mhm.
So a nice mix here. Got 55% saying they're going to go at it alone, 30% with a co-author, and 15% co-editing a book with multiple contributors. Very good. All right, so I'm going to start this question over with Gamma. So what are some considerations and issues around co-authoring versus solo authoring that you came across?
Right, Dan. Yeah, thank you. I don't think there is a formula as far as one right way or wrong way. It really depends, I think, on three factors. One is, do you have something that you see that you feel that urgent urge to produce something, and it's an idea that you have been developing over time, and it's been percolating in your brain. It's just kind of ready for it. I mean, that would be the way that you would go solo. So not this is my shameless plug, I'm sorry, but yeah, my next book coming out in January, called Global Leadership. It's a solo, and it was something that for literally 3 decades, the idea has been working and percolating in my brain, and then it finally found that voice. But I think the second possibility is that you have this idea, but you don't have the complete picture. And so finding a co-author is a way to enhance the book. And I think that was, for instance, my experience in partnering with Sadhna, is that the publisher initially came to me saying, can you do a book about teaching leadership? Now, I could draw from my experience here at McDonough in Marietta, but we were particularly strong on the curricular side. So my thinking was that how can I complement this with another program that's very strong on the co-curricular side? So the Rockefeller program at Dartmouth became a logical possibility. So I went to Sadhna and said, would you like to work on this project? And she said, let's do it. And so it became very organic, but it worked really well. The third possibility is that, I mean, with the edited volume, is when you're asked to be kind of the leader to bring people together. And that's a different style, where you're really facilitating something that will produce the result for an edited volume. I have not done an edited volume, maybe next year.
Thank you, Gamma. All right, and so I'm going to move over to Kathy, because she's one of the other author teams here. So beyond choosing to torture yourself and work with me throughout the process of this book, what were some things you learned with respect to who's going to work with the publisher, first author credit, all the different things that go through that process?
Right. And I think some of my thought process in asking Dan to join was similar to you, Gamma. Like, how do I not fall into with the content, just my information, right, that I was providing? And really, one of the reasons I really wanted to do stuff, information around pedagogy, and I know Dan, having his doctoral work focused in curriculum and instruction, that was huge. That was like, that is a different set of ideas and lenses that he could bring to the table. But the other thing, I'll be quite honest with co-authoring, is I like Dan as a person. He's fun, right? And that was important for me as a co-author team. I needed someone that I could be honest with. I could be like, look, I have to check out this week. How can you pick up, right? Or vice versa. And so as we continue to try to move things forward, and that wasn't only in the content development, but in working with the publisher, right? Because that is a whole nother, which we're going to get into, but that's a whole nother set of responsibilities. And how are we doing that, to checking references and making sure you have all your stuff in APA, which is what we use. I mean, there's all those tedious things, as well as the content development with formatting and so forth. And so it was one of those things that not only did I need to have someone that had the content expert, but that I did like, right? I mean, that I could say, hey, how do we go through this together and be a true partnership? And so that was a big piece of it. But I think the division of labor, if you will say, you have to figure out like what works for that team. And so, because as we know with any co-authored or multi-authors, that there's different voices involved, but then how do you write or make sure that it is one voice, or that the voices can come together, so it's not that someone can read it and say, oh, that's totally Dan, or oh, that's totally Kathy, but that they can see that how it strings and threads together, even though reality is, okay, you're going to take the lead on this chapter, you're going to take the lead on that, and then how do we come together and do that? And so that was a big piece of my, and I think our process, right, Dan? I think that was a lot of just working together and saying, hey, I can't do this. Can you do it? Literally, I can think of our conversations and saying, I won't be able to meet this deadline. The other thing that I'll circle back to was, it was important for me to have a partner in crime, as I call Dan all the time, is someone who could give me energy when I was feeling like, oh, I don't know if I can do this anymore, right? Someone who could say, no, we got this, let's keep going. And so that partnership truly was a partnership. So it's not just a co-author, let's just put the content on paper, but how are we developing the ideas? And I loved some of our conversations, I think, where we would have great discourse. Like, I don't know about that. I don't agree, from my lens. And he'd be like, I don't agree. And we'd go back and forth, but I think it made it truly the content was much stronger, because he was like, nope, I don't agree. We need to have conversation about this. And so I really appreciated that part of that relationship, that it was good, right? It was moving us forward instead of stopping us in our tracks. Dan, you're smiling.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, I mean, they were always welcome challenges. You know, it was constructive criticism. It was, heavy thinking about, I don't know if it was Dale Carnegie or who it was that said, if two people are in business together and they always agree, one of them isn't needed, or something to that effect. And so, it was always just great debate, and we learned so much from each other, it was just such a great process for sure. And so, one of the things we joked about when we were putting this panel together was the question, would you have that person over for dinner? And so, if not, then, that's probably not the person you want to spend, 2 years working on a book together. And so, think of those folks that both you like to work with, but that also challenge your perspectives, and that you like to get into, hearty debates with, for sure. So, no, thank you, Kathy. All right, so we're gonna move down here to our next poll question. And so we've talked a little bit about getting started and think about a publisher. Do I write by myself? Do I write with somebody else? Would I have this person over for dinner? So what do you think will be the biggest obstacle to beginning your process? So that poll should be up on your screen there. Give you about 30 seconds to respond. All right, about 5 more seconds. All right, and see if I can get these results up on the screen here. Okay, so 40% said getting a publisher, and 36% said making the time, 21% said honing the topic, and then not too many folks said meeting deadlines or the editing process. Well, we may or may not challenge your perspectives a little bit here, but that's so we're going to start this part of the conversation with Barbara Crosby. So, Barbara, what's been your experience with respect to? We'll start with finding a publisher, and then kind of take us down some of your the path of some of your thinking in these areas.
Well, I do think that even before you launch this quest to find a publisher, there should be two things to focus on. Probably the first one is to get very clear in your mind why this particular book needs to be written, or article, or series of chapters, or whatever. What's missing in the publishing world that you can fill? And I think you've heard from every one of us that we had a strong sense of why the world needed our great insights. And so also, what's distinctive about your experience and your voice that would add something to this topic? And I think Gamma was saying, you know, you mull over something for quite some time, you know it's there, you know you want to do this. So to have that pretty clear in your mind as you launch the effort. The other is, who cares? You know, who is the audience for your particular take, your perspective on whatever this is? And I think we often have multiple audiences, and as you set out to write a book, you basically have two big audiences. One is the publishing world, those gatekeepers, and it's linked to, though, your ultimate audience. And I think, you know, you heard me say I had two main audiences: the newcomers to leadership studies, and then seasoned educators. And I kept both of those in mind as I wrote. And then there may be kind of subgroups within that you need to think back over your writing to say, you know, have I left people out by the language I'm using or something like that, or have I offered enough for these different subgroups? But you know, most publishers are going to expect you to be able, in your proposal, to articulate very clearly why this book needs to be written and published, why it should be you, and also then who's your audience. And so then the next step would be to say, all right, if my audience is this and that, which publishers seem to connect to those audiences? And you know, I think almost all of us, if not every one of us, has spent time at conferences like the upcoming ILA conference, checking out the publishers to see what kind of things they're publishing, starting to make those connections with editors and reps, and with our colleagues who've had publishing experience. I mean, every last book that I've published has somehow resulted from my connections with my colleagues, with the editors. This teaching leadership book actually was published as a result of kind of a serendipitous lunch meeting. I didn't know that I was sitting down with the editor of a series and talked to him about what I was working on. And he said, "Oh, I think this might fit." You know, so using those connections, going to the exhibit hall at ILA, et cetera, doing your research to save yourself some time. Those are starting places, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Barbara. Anything else you'd add with respect to you know, the publishing process, expectations with the publisher? Anything else you'd add around in those areas?
Well, I can add a few things, and then others ought to pitch in.
Sure.
We were in our pre-conference conversations talking about the importance of getting straight with a publisher. What kind of marketing plan would they have for your book? What is the timeline? How much flexibility have you got? What is the editing process going to be like? I think, you know, as you're setting out to write a book, you're thinking mainly about the writing, and you have to also build in a lot of attention to the follow-up to the writing, the whole editing, and all the work that you as an author are going to have to do to help the marketers. So getting those kinds of things clear with your publisher, quite important.
Super, thank you. And Kathy, I know you wanted to share a little bit about this, with respect to, the importance around, preparation and all the things from, the research to having a network, and those super, super, super valuable graduate assistants, and everything in between. So
Yes, for
please.
sure. Well, sometimes I feel that in all professions, whether it's leadership education, higher ed, I mean, all the disciplines that we come to in leadership, that we sometimes are working in silos. And so you had talked about, Dan, the network. It's how are we getting outside of those silos? So how are we not working with the same people we always work with? And so, I have my student affairs and my higher ed colleagues, but how am I getting outside of that around leadership education, that topic, to really understand where everyone's coming from? And so that is really not only building the networks and writing for an audience, but it's also thinking through, letting those ideas kind of percolate, or really kind of, letting them marinate, whatever word you want to use, to think about, well, so how does this come, in different lenses and different disciplines come into this, area of leadership and leadership learning. And so I think sometimes, and Gama, you said that about letting it percolate or letting it kind of think about it. But then also when you actually start writing, allowing yourself grace to change some of that. Because I know once we got into the process, we were like, okay, we had a thought, but now I'm not so sure. And it probably was result of some of those great conversations, Dan. But we were like, we need to move this a little differently, or it's going to look a little differently than we had originally thought. And so, and sometimes you have to talk to the publisher about that, and sometimes you don't. It depends on your relationship and what the setup is. There's some publishers that are much more, no, this is what you said, you need to stick to it. And then there's some that are like, no, you are the expert in the content. So what do you think? And so thinking through even some of that when you're looking to build a relationship with a publisher or a series editor, and how that really can look. I would also say having support around you. And so I know I am very lucky to have, of course, a great support system, but I have great doctoral students that I really rely on. And so after we had, for our book, had some outside readers, I had 4 different doc students look at it and edit it. So they could catch some of my APA errors or our sentence structures, or the best thing was they would say, we don't quite know what you mean here. And that was like, right, thank you for that. I will say, I kind of laugh and I'm going to own it, but there was one part in our book that after it got published, we saw a huge mistake in a diagram. And I started thinking about how we had 7 people edit, right? So not outside readers for content, but actually look at editing. We had 7 people and we all missed this one error, which actually was a pretty big error, I'll be honest. But then also the thing is that whenever we called the publisher and said, hey, we need to change this, he was like, we're on it. And the next day it was changed. And that was huge for me, that the publisher was like, I'm all in with you, right? Not like, oh, too bad, which I've worked with another publisher that they've said too bad, right? And so thinking through what is, as Barbara said, what is that kind of agreement with marketing or with editing, or what is really that built upon. But you cannot underestimate editing. I would say that, like, that's why the editing process, I was like, oh, and I think I felt that way a little too until I got into it. And then especially when I saw the mistakes after 7 of us edited with a fine tooth comb, and I was like, oh, wow. And I'm still seeing, I shouldn't tell Dan this, but I saw a mistake just the other day and I was like, right? Like, I'm seeing laughter because we all have done that, right? You're like, oh, that sentence is not right. And so, but that wasn't big enough to call the publisher and be like, hey, we need to change this. But it definitely is a bigger part of it than I thought, right? I mean, yes, so you have copy editors in the publisher and they have experts doing this, but also that is part of the author's responsibility. So not only creating content, but then making sure that it is ready to go. So just some of my quick thoughts on it.
Mm-hmm. Great. No, thank you. Yeah, and I'd agree. It's just so much preparation from doing the research and going back through your dissertations and making sure you're not reinventing the wheel here or there, or getting a team of grad assistants to do annotated lit reviews and bibliographies, and checking with your network. Hey, has anybody written anything on this or that? And you'd be willing to to share some of your resources, or Dropbox folders full of articles, and depending again on the approach of the book that you're taking. But it really took a village, with kind of the to get through these processes, and the support system definitely, I would say, just like writing a dissertation or a thesis, you've got to have that support system, whether be a combination of colleagues and your family and your friends or what have you. So great. So Yal, I know you wanted to share a little bit about your experiences with the publisher, as well as whether or not your employer may reward book writing.
Yeah. So let me go ahead and say, as a solo writer, the village is still really important. I have my own editor, working with the publisher, working with lots of other people to make sure that we're on target and that there's not just my opinion, but others' opinion as well. I'm not the expert. The students would say, you're not the only person, you're not the only idea. So I wanted to talk about also with the colleagues. I had been at an ILA conference and was with the book authors and really started talking to different authors and got a lot of great tips from them about, you know, uh, future publishers, where to go, the marketing. You have to market. That's really the bottom line. Your publisher is there, but you are the marketer of your book. And there's other miscellaneous expenses that you're going to want to look into with your publisher. I wanted to say, with my publisher of my first book, for my second book, I gave them first chance. They took a year to decide that they didn't want to do it because they are looking really of going in a different direction. They want a Barnes and Noble's bestseller. So leadership, unfortunately, leadership education books are not on the New York Times bestseller list. So it's really important to understand who the publisher is and what they're publishing about. And if you think you're going to get rich, you're probably not. And also, yeah, and if you think that your bosses or your employers are going to really love this book, I was told you didn't mention the university prominently enough. Even though 2 chapters were dedicated to the book, I heard from the director you didn't put my name in it. So various other things that I have heard. So it's not going to guarantee a position or a promotion. So just be aware of that. And unfortunately, people get jealous that you've published and they're lagging behind. And I know that sounds a little bit egotistical, but it's not meant to be. It's very competitive. The other thing is, I know, and then I'll stop, a lot of people in this webinar didn't put down the editing part of a volume. There's also the option of contributing an edited a chapter to an edited volume, which I've done. So that's another way to look at it too, and get your feet kind of wet into that editing process. So thank you, Dan.
Thank you. And Sana, I know you may have had a different experience with respect to a positive with your employer really supporting your process of embarking on publishing a book. What can you share about that?
Yeah, so I just consider myself incredibly fortunate because the director of the Rockefeller Center, right from the beginning after Gamma proposed the idea, really was behind me with this whole process. And honestly, if there was any time, any resource that he could direct towards the work, I'm so grateful to Andrew Samwick. But also, I think what was also important was he was a true friend in the process, which was really not saying everything is good, So he was critical, but he was gently critical. And he was mildly critical and then constructively critical. So I think that all those characteristics, when you are supporting somebody in the writing process, those are very, very important. And there were times when I think I would get stuck with an idea which I obstinately thought needed to be in the book. he was pretty, I think, very firm but extremely gentle in saying, do you think there's another way to say this? But looking back, I just thought it was done so well. And I feel like anybody who's around somebody who's writing for the first time should think about being constructively critical in that way. The other part, I think, is what Kathy says. I have not dared to read the book cover to cover so far, and it was just printed in July because somebody just joked with me and said, Did you see a typo on the cover?" After that, it was like, oh my God, that's rough. So I know that there are going to be those errors. So I invite everybody to read this book and tell me. So that's going to be a very gentle process.
That's funny. No, thank you.
If I could add a couple of points here that I think the point that Kathy made about the student involvement is very, very important. And I think even with writing a solo, there are so many opportunities when you write a book to involve students in that process. And I think that can also be a great indirect benefit of the process, is that you're also coaching and you're mentoring the next generation of scholars. So I would also think that as another why in terms of the process. The other one is that it is a labor of love, that there are, all these questions that related to Barbara's point of the audience, is that, am I saying this at the right level, to the right tone? And as you're going through it, that's the importance of having, to me, it was very helpful having a co-author to be able to bounce off ideas and saying, okay, I had this great thought and I wrote it down. It's the best paragraph that I have ever written in my life. And then I gave it to Sadhna, and Sadhna's saying, what were you thinking? This makes no sense. It just crushes your ego, but in a healthy way, that you really learn about taking feedback, learning how to express yourself in ways that reach a wider audience. So it's a great process.
So I would like to add just a couple of things. And
Sure.
one of those is, I talked about getting your audience clear even before you set out to write and get a book proposal accepted. I've found it extremely helpful, as I actually do the writing, to be writing to actual individuals. So often I have chosen one person or two people that I want to be sure I'm communicating with as I write. And in the most recent book, the Teaching Leadership book, I actually had one of those people read the draft, and it really helped a lot. Kind of shifting a little bit concerning how the whole project of book writing is viewed by your university, say. I wanted to say that often books don't count as much as publishing and refereed journals. And so I think in those cases, you really need to be careful to see books as part of your entire writing agenda and work out ways that your other writing can add up or contribute to your book project. Maybe take a sabbatical or something in order to write your book.
That's great. No, thank you. I think we've heard from everybody here, and what a wealth and variety of perspectives. It is quite the process, and so we're gonna as we think about the time involved and the process. So let's move on to our next poll question here. And so, thinking back to the last poll, 36% of you said making the time you think would be your biggest obstacle, but only 2% said meeting deadlines. So a very ambitious group. We might have Achiever in the top 5 of our Gallup Strengths Finder. But meeting the deadlines won't be a problem as long as I have a publisher and I make the time. So, but let's jump in and see, just how long do we think this process is going to take? So how long do you think it will take from securing a publisher to the final publication of your books? This is our final poll for the webinar. I'm going to give you all about 30 seconds to respond here. All right, about 5 more seconds. All right. And let's take a look at the results here. So, okay, we've got some realists in the group. So 60% said almost 2 years, 3 years or more, 21%, about a year, 13%, 6 months, says about 6% of y'all. So I know that Barbara had some things she wanted to share about this, and we'll hear from some of our other panelists, about how long to expect the process to take, thinking about from pre-writing and the publisher and the manuscript and setbacks and deadlines and the academic audience, and the list goes on and on. So Barbara, take it away.
Well, I'm really glad, like you, Dan, to see some realists out there. I have not known anybody to publish a substantial work in less than 2 years from the start to the finish. I'm sure there are some, especially if you can do self-publishing, but my experience is whatever you think it's going to be, double it, because there are so many different things to consider. Things come onto your own agenda. If you're co-authoring with somebody, they can have things happen. Often we forget that the editing process can take almost as long as writing the book. If you're dependent on interviews or original research that you're conducting as part of the writing process, that's going to add in. So, trying to be as realistic as you possibly can about how long it's going to take you to actually produce the manuscript, and then adding in months of back and forth to be sure you've got permissions, to be sure that you've checked out all those things that Kathy mentions, that you thought you had it all right, but lo and behold, this chapter doesn't mesh with the other chapter. You said one thing here that contradicts something else. All of that stuff goes on. So I would always say that. And then, if you're editing a volume, you might have as many as 7 or 8 or 10 other authors involved for whom things can go wrong. I mean, this last book, I was originally co-authoring with 2 other people. One of them died very sadly, and the other one dropped out, so you've got to redo. So at any rate, trying to be realistic that at least 2 years will probably elapse, possibly more, but having some idea of when are those milestones that you want to reach, and being able to see how it's going as you progress.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and I know you had some thoughts too, just real quickly about academic cycles and kind of the audience with respect to whether the book may or may not be a textbook,
Yep.
as you envision it.
Yeah. Well, a lot of us, of course, are hoping that our books would get adopted for use in the classroom. And many publishers really want evidence from you that your book will be useful as a textbook. And then, the timelines that they set out are often geared towards the academic year cycles when they expect people to be adopting a book. And so if you don't get your manuscript in on time, and therefore the publisher can't help you on time get your book out to meet those cycles, then you might be stuck for another 6 months or something. So, that's another important reason to tell everybody in your life, I'm writing this book and I'm not doing anything else, and bring me some dinner, please.
You're so
I'll
right.
try
Yeah.
that next time.
My goodness. Yeah, I remember, briefly the 6 to 8 weeks or so before our hard deadline versus some of those, I don't know, maybe we'll call them fake or ghost deadlines that Kathy and I had along the process. But that last 6 to 8 weeks, I mean, I just remember, the bus would come for my two school-age daughters, and I would go in the office and write until the bus came in the afternoon. Meals and personal needs, and that was about it. For that last 6 to 8 weeks, because it's just knocking out those things. And my goodness, you know, is it a labor of love, as Gama said. Son, I know you wanted to share a little bit about your joy about the writing process.
Yeah, it was so interesting. It was almost like being on a roller coaster. So some days, words will flow, and there were days when I would just say, why did I take on this project? And what will Gama think about me? And what will people think about me? Look at Gama nodding knowingly. But I think the whole thing is to just deal with the monster and crush it, man. You just have to crush it. And the way you crush it is, I thought about, I've been talking to so many people around me and people who've written about this. So I just wanted to use my few seconds on this to just give some ideas, because some of them might work for you and some of them may not work for you. So I think first thing is, um, take this idea and break it down into its component parts and just work on one tiny bit at a time. And all of a sudden, it works. The second idea is to think about it as a jigsaw puzzle and pull it together in little pieces. And all of a sudden, it might not be the jigsaw puzzle you thought about in the beginning, but now it is a gorgeous piece of work. And then you have to kill it, as Gama said. Yeah, but at least you got something right there. The third one for linear thinkers, I think, is making copious outlines. And the fourth one is for non-linear thinkers like me, is to do mind mapping, which is really important. I think that I got unstuck so many times because of just mind mapping. And then I thought about another idea, which was reading books about writing well. And those books actually unstick you in many different ways. Also, you just go, okay, I was belly aching about grammar. I don't really need to do this. I just need to write. And then the last thing I'm going to say is write. Write something, write anything, for God's sake, when you're feeling stuck, and you will suddenly see the words start flowing. And I guess I had another idea, which was write 50 words. Don't let yourself go. Just write 50 words and say 50 words is not much, but the 50 words will become 500 very quickly. And so I think those are some of my thoughts, because I know I went through so many processes, and it was very, sometimes really overwhelming. And I think finally, Kathy and all my fellow friends on the panel have referred to this, which is you have got to lean on your family and your friends who can support you and sometimes give you, peace of their mind also. It's like move on. And I think Gama in this respect was extremely helpful, I think, as a co-author.
Right. Yeah, thank you.
Do you care if I add something to that real quick?
Go ahead, Kathy.
Well, no, it sparked something because I had a point where I was like, oh my gosh, like, Dan and I have been working on this for so long. And while we laid out the outline, we've been working on it. I was like, is anyone going to want to read this? Like, what, is it going to be worth anything? And I remember walking into the kitchen and saying to my partner, I said, Brian, I need to just tell you why I'm doing this. And he's like, okay. And I just it went back to that why piece we had first talked about. And I'm like, because we need to have better leadership educators, because then we need more folks to learn leadership so that, and there was this whole thing, and it came back to my 5-year-old daughter, our 5-year-old daughter, that I want a better world for her, right? And so I traced it all the way back as how am I going to contribute to that, my little slice to then, and he just looked at me and he goes, "That's great, Kathy. I think you just answered your own question." And it gave me such different energy. And so I think about going back to that. So why am I doing this again? And then I actually free wrote why I was doing it. And then that got me unstuck, right? So then, because I was having that moment of doubt, and then it allowed me to think, no, this is not the end all be all. Absolutely not. But it's starting a conversation. It's starting a little slice of that conversation so that others after us can build upon it, right? And so once I got that through my head, but I appreciate those comments, because there are times, I think for everyone, it's very different in how we can move along in this process and the roller coaster that you said. I hear you, yes. And so how do we do that? So I just wanted to add that little story, because it's how do we do that in our own way? And for me, it was like, well, so really, I'm like 12 steps removed, but really why I'm doing this is my daughter. And I had to back it up, So thank you for sharing that.
Really good point.
Great. Yeah, and Yael, I know you wanted to add a little bit and kind of piggyback on what Kathy and Sana were saying about having multiple people involved in that process, and just for all of our participants. So we're going to move from this part to the Q&A portion. So just to kind of have that on the tip of your nose as you're thinking about where we are in the webinar. So Yael.
Yeah, I think I remember when I was writing my doctoral dissertation that after it was done, it was a labor of love, and then I was done. That was it. And kind of alluding to what Sadhna said, I don't go over my book anymore. Once it was done, it was done. I refer to it. I've used it in classes. I've talked to other people about it. But I said what I needed to say, and now it's time to move on. And I think that was really important for me as well, to do that. I also wanted to bring in just very quickly with the publisher. Remember, most publishers only want you to send in a copy of your manuscript to them. You have to wait back to hear from them. So that might add to your timeline that we haven't put in as consideration. So also, there was a question, Dan, do you mind if I go into that? A question about do publishers pay advances? I don't know what other people have experienced. Unless you have a name, a really big name in publishing, you've written a lot of books, generally the answer is going to be there's no advances for you. I don't know, anyone else have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no. I mean, you can have especially if you have published with the same publisher, that you can negotiate. So, for instance, next book, you're going to do the indexing. The publisher will do the indexing. The publisher will take care of all the fees for permissions. So you can negotiate those in advance, where it's not going to come from your pocketbook. The publisher is taking that responsibility.
So I think that goes back to some publishers have fees for graphics, for indexing, for copyrighted material if they go through that. But at this level, I really, they may take it out of your royalties, which aren't very much to begin with, but generally they're not going to give you an advance.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, and so we're gonna, and it seems like we've got quite a few questions coming in specifically about the publisher and publication process with respect to costs and time and access and things of that nature. So, does anyone else have anything to share about, the timeline, working out a timeline, that process before we move to Q&A?
Dan, I would like to just simply say in the timeline, we've all alluded to it in one way or another, but it's really important to get input from a lot of people into the final product. So build that in and think about a good idea becoming a great idea with the input of many.
Great. Absolutely. Thank you. All right. So you've got the question tab in your GoToWebinar panel there, and would love to give you all an opportunity to ask some questions. So we did get a lot of questions, and I want to start with that with respect to the publishing process. So we talked a little bit about you know, the money involved. So I'm going to kind of bundle these questions together, and I'll ask it like this. What are the costs involved with the publishing process, and how do you what are the costs involved with the publishing process, and how do you get through that process with respect to finding access to and involving a publisher to the publication of the book? And I know you had some insight there, and then I would certainly open up to any of our other panelists after that, and then I'll go to the next question. So, Yael?
Yes, there are author guidelines on almost all publishing websites. So it's really important to do your research, see what the author guidelines are. It will give you an idea what they're looking for, tell you the formatting, everything else. And it will also give you who to submit your manuscript to.
I would add to that that you can also send queries to the representatives of the publisher and say, here's what I'm thinking about. Is this something that your house is likely to be interested in? That can be an interim step so that you don't submit a full-blown proposal to a publisher that really isn't interested, and you might be able to get some feedback from that kind of exchange that would help you decide what kind of publisher to go for. And you can also do this face-to-face at the conferences where you're meeting with the publishing reps. So sometimes that kind of preliminary step can be helpful. I've always had people respond to me when I've submitted that kind of question, and so it's something you can do as well.
Great. And does anyone have ballpark of costs? We're getting a couple questions just to kind of close out this part of working with the publisher. With respect to indexing or any other costs that came up in the process?
I think one big cost that could be, but again, it just depends on publishing and the agreements. And so it's really a hard question because what we might have had with our publisher is different than someone else. But I do know that a cost that often pops up unexpectedly is graphic design. So whether you have images or unless you're really good at it, which I am not, but do you have that visual? I mean, I have a friend who published a book and said that he spent like $2,000 of his own money just in graphic design work. And so really thinking through how is that, what do you rely on for that? And so that's something that creeps up. And indexing, I think publishing is really changing as a field or as a industry. There's much more focus on print on demand, and that might have a different type of cost compared to we're going to publish and print 3,000 of your books, and then it's going to sit in a warehouse and you need to. And again, so that agreement is so important, right? And I think more and more places are going to that print on demand because they're popping up all over the country. I just actually published a children's book, and so I learned a lot about the print on demand with that versus how does it look different in the different types of books, in the different kind of disciplines and different publishers, because I used a different publisher than for my academic writing. And so I think it's really changing. And also because you can get it more on Google, books or Kindles, you can do online formats as well, that's changing. And so all of that is that's wrapped up in those costs that I know when I first started in this journey, I had no idea about. And so I think that is also something to take into consideration. I don't know if that helps, Dan, but I think it is such a knowing, as Barbara said right in the beginning, having that, agreement with your publisher is really critical.
Well, and indexing is an issue. Some people just feel like I'm not going to give up that control. I'm going to do it myself. But indexing is a skill. It's something that's pretty time demanding, and so typically I've always given it up because I just can't handle the requirement. But if you want control, you're going to have to do it yourself. But it's terribly time consuming if that's not your particular skill. One other thing I would mention to be aware of is that the academic publishing world is in quite a dynamic situation at the moment, and you can expect editors to come and go in the course of 2 years. I had 4 for my teaching leadership book, and that can be unsettling.
Yeah.
And you might feel like you've negotiated things out very clearly with editor number 1, and by the time you're at editor number 3, that understanding has kind of mutated. So it's a fact of life in the academic publishing world these days. It's very much in upheaval.
Mm-hmm.
So, Dan, I
Sure.
want to add one last part related to looking at publishing with the lens of marketing as well. So that cost is really, as I think it was Kathy or one of the panelists alluded to, that cost is an cost that we have to take into consideration because the onus of really marketing everything is on us. So this means that we have to really understand right from the beginning. It's almost like beginning with the end in mind and understanding where exactly you're going to target and what populations you're going to target and why. So, and especially when it comes to print on demand, because I know for a fact, even with this book, because there were limited copies that were being produced, there was a time when someone said, oh, maybe I'll consider ordering fewer rather than more. So we might, and I do want to give that feedback to the publisher as well. So those are the kind of considerations too.
That's great. Thank you. So I've had a couple questions with respect to how to involve students, and we alluded to that earlier in the writing process. And of course, this could be anything from undergraduates to doc students, everything in between. And so, Kathy, I just know from working with you on this project how much you involved many of the graduate students, particularly those in the Leadership Learning Research Center there at Florida State. So, what can you add about some of the creative ways to get students involved in the process?
Absolutely. And I think about constantly how to involve on all levels, right? Undergraduate, master's, and doctoral. And as we know, they all have different skills and abilities that they're able to bring forward. But I try to do it at every step of the road. I'm always telling Dan, hey, I have a great student in mind for that who could help us with this. And so anything from organizing thoughts, but I think where they were the most, and I did this, and actually I'm working on a project right now where I have had a model that I'm kind of working on, like a visual, and I actually have gone in front of undergraduates, masters, and doctoral students and saying, what do you see from this? And then they give feedback. And I explained to them that this is for a book and that they're part of this process, that it's so that we are able to set, to create better learning environments for leadership. And they are so engaged in that process. And so every step that I possibly can, whether it is a visual or an idea, or what are the best ways that you're taught leadership? I mean, I've gone into classes and asked that. And so really every step of the way, beyond research, beyond editing, I do a lot of getting chapters in front of students and saying, okay, so can you comment in the actual document what you don't or what you do understand? And they're like, really? I'm like, yes, feedback is love. I say that to you all the time, and now I want to receive your love in that. And at first they're a little hesitant, I'll be honest, especially undergraduate students, to give me that feedback, but saying, no, this is going to make this better, because especially depending on the audience, who is that audience for? And so thinking through, so really I believe that students can be involved in every step of the process in every way. I've had students then come up to me afterwards after they're like, I gave you that idea. I'm like, yes, you did. That conversation was part of what got me to this place, right? And we're all lifelong learners. And so I think sometimes pulling back that curtain for students is even more of a developmental opportunity than, it's not like, oh, I just sit down and brilliance comes from my fingertips. Oh no, it's quite opposite actually. And so how do I involve students in that process, and especially doc students in that space, right? I loved it when I had one doc student in our book, Dan, said, Kathy, what are you didn't even finish the sentence here. And I was like, yes, do not do that for your dissertation, right? And so thinking it was a very powerful partnership in that. But yes, we had them doing, research, doing annotated bibs, and I tried to match it up with what their interest in leadership is. I also try to get students in front of other leadership educators, just so knowing that it's not just the story that they hear at Florida State, but how are people really having dynamic leadership learning opportunities and setting up environments to teach and learn leadership. And so trying to get folks in that space. And so is there anything I'm missing, Dan? Because you were through that process. I was like, hey, yay, yeah.
Could I add something related to what Kathy said? As you're doing this, be sure to write down all these names.
Yeah.
Because later on, when you're writing your acknowledgement, you don't want to leave anybody out of that process. And side note, you did a great job with that, with our book, even to the point almost before we turned everything in. Oh, I have one more name. So you did a great job with that.
Yeah, and just I think it was really good because we kept a really good track of the people who, even if they said a sentence, we wrote their name down. And because it was valuable and it helped organize us. And I think I want to really say close to 200 people who might have helped us in different ways. And I think it was amazing, the project, because now everybody comes and says they think they own the book, which is so exciting.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, no, and I just would echo. It's humanizing to ask for help, and it's a great way to model academia, for your students. It's not just as Kathy said, shooting lightning bolts of knowledge out of your fingertips into the computer. You need that feedback, whether it's a typo or a conceptual block of some type. These are really, really important processes. That are just, kind of branch out from just this idea of being a leadership educator, but, being a mentor and being a coach to students, certainly those that are advancing and want to enter the field, as a faculty member or, student affairs professional or what have you. So I got two more questions we're going to definitely get to. If you want to go ahead and ask yours too, we still may have time to get to one more before we finish up at 30 minutes after the hour. The next one was a question about any advice for writing your dissertation in a way that might lead to a book later. Beginning with the end in mind again, as we're thinking about that. I can share a little bit, and then I'd love to hear from some of the other panelists. I know that I had kind of in the back of my head when I was writing my dissertation, that there would be pieces of it that would easily translate, which ended up happening. The work that I did was looking at, which instructional and assessment strategies or pedagogies were used most frequently by leadership educators. And this was particularly in undergraduate classes. And these were folks that had taught, 4-credit academic courses. And in order to really make the literature review robust, I had to spend a good amount of time, per my major professor, Dr. Jim Eisen, looking at discussion as pedagogy. What's the background of college teaching behind that? How is it applied in leadership education? And then looking at role play, looking at case studies, looking at simulation, looking at games, looking at lecture, and the list goes on and on. And so we were able to pick and choose quite a bit of that and use it in the chapters of the book that are now, we have a whole chapter on how to use, personality tests and self-assessments. There's a chapter on case studies, there's a chapter on discussion, how to give feedback, all these things. So not that it was just a copy and paste, because there's literature that has certainly been written between now and then. But I think that at least almost the whole second half of the book came with kind of that end in mind when the dissertation was being written. I don't know, I may be fudging it a bit to have had that hindsight, but I certainly thought, hey, one day I'd love to put something like this together that could help others because of what I've learned through learning more about the college literature or college teaching literature behind particular instructional and assessment strategies and how they're now used in leadership education. Certainly my experience had grown and things of that nature. But, probably the literature review, maybe the area to spend more time on if you're trying to be proactive, because those are always things that you can, can turn into more knowledge. Probably not your results section or your method section. So chapters 3 and 4, maybe not so much. 5, definitely. If you're thinking about dissertation, that discussion, the implications, things of that nature, that's where you're really the pedal hits the metal with respect to what others are going to want to read. Why does what you found matter and how is it applied to the field? Others that have insight there?
I remember way back when my research advisor said, just get your dissertation over with, just get your doctorate. Don't worry about writing that book, that will come later. But the process itself with the dissertation, I still use, I'm using it for my second book. The information really is informing that book, even though it's kind of old. It's learning how to do the proper research, how to research really to your topic, and it gives you direction. So that's it. Yeah.
That's great.
I think I was very lucky because I was in a doctoral program that I chose in part because it allowed me to write a book and then have a separate, let's say, chapter or two on my methodology and kind of the heavy duty research and theoretical aspects. So when I published Leadership for Global Citizenship back in the 90s, that basically was my dissertation. But I left out the extra stuff that I had to do for the dissertation.
That's great. Thank you. Let's see. So the next question we've got on here was, so if your book's not going to be on the New York Times bestseller list, what's the potential distribution, and therefore what are some potential revenue streams? And then I'll just add in this question that came in a few minutes ago, thoughts about having an agent, as part of that process. So, if it's not going to be a bestseller, what are some other potential revenue streams and opportunities for distribution?
Well, I think that is where you really depend on your network. If you're in an institution with a lot of alumni, then I think what we found, Sadhna and I, in terms of the book, is seeing how excited that our graduates were that the possibility of this book coming out. So they also served with a lot of the marketing that they did. I think also you have your own marketing plan, but also aligning that with your publisher, making sure that you are on the same wavelength.
That's great.
Dan, may I add also? So
Sure.
I think that this is where market segmentation becomes really important, and you are really looking at your target audiences in a different way. when you look at, so for example, when I look at the book Gama and I have co-authored, it has multiple uses, and it depends on the alumni base, it depends on the NGO sector, it depends on the not-for-profit sector, because some of the concepts and the ideas and the ideologies really, I think, just, blend across all these sectors. So I think that when you're looking at your networks, you need to see who is interested in what, and then really, there's nothing that we write or do that's original in my mind. So one time my environmental sciences professor simply said to us, when we were in a master's program thinking we were very, very smart, and he just said, rid yourselves of the notion that there's any time an original idea, because it's always a combination of ideas that becomes an innovative practice. So I really felt so humbled from that moment. And I think adapting, adjusting to your environment and your context becomes really important. So this said, I feel like first, I honestly don't want to work with people who I don't enjoy working with. So that's yeah. So all 5 of you, it's been great. But my point here is this, that you're going to invest a great amount of time in building your network. So do it for fun. Do it for the why of why you're doing it, and do it for the quality of what you're trying to achieve and the impact in the community. The minute these things come together, I think magic happens.
Yep.
So I would build
Right.
off of the magic in the community and how, because I know from the very beginning, as I said, my why is how do I make a better world for my daughter, right? And so, backing that up, it was how are we engaging in the conversation? But I think something that Dana and I have talked about quite a bit that I think I was pleasantly surprised as we're getting the information of the book out there, whether it's through presentations or it's through conversations, the different ways that we're able to do that, was then we were having people, both of us have folks asking us to speak on it, whether it's on campuses or in community agencies or in corporations, to talk about the material in the book. And so that is an extra revenue stream. Now, it's not large, it's not huge, but for me, the purpose was more about getting the information out. But that side kind of extra, income stream was appreciated and helped kind of offset some of the things. Because I was telling Dan just the other day how many books I have purchased and given to folks, right? And so whether it's the students that helped me or the folks that are my strong network, and so that offset some of that cost up front. But I think getting the other ways and how you're getting your book out there beyond what was already said is getting the knowledge out at conferences, in conversations, or where are those spaces that your audience will be that you might not think is not the traditional way, right? So is it using social media? Is it, so it's not just an email, but how are you getting in front of people to have the conversation about, this is why this matters, right? This is why I do this, and this is why you should read it, and so
Right.
thinking through, kind of the different aspects that way.
Great. Any other thoughts on that question? That was the last question that we had come in about revenue streams, whether you should get an agent, and distribution.
A couple of quick observations, Dan, and
Sure.
especially for the ones who are writing their first book or getting ready for the first book. Something that, at least from my perspective, writing my first book, is overcoming what I call the imposter syndrome. That you feel kind of shy about saying, oh, I'm writing a book. That somehow people think, oh, you're writing a book. But really owning it, that you have something that you'd like to share. And I think once you own, that can also work as a check on you that people don't forget, and they keep asking, how's the book? So that can also be a motivator that you don't want to look foolish, so you have to write that book. So that could be one nice loop.
That's right.
About the question on hiring an agent. I personally have not used one. I've had friends who have used agents. You know, again, that relationship is something to pay attention to be sure you're working with somebody that understands what you're up to and who really does have the kind of contacts you need. You know, so I would say that's particularly important if you do want to try to have a trade publication where you know, reach very large audiences. I think agents are particularly helpful if that's the route that you're choosing to go, and maybe that is the right route for you.
Great. Thank you. Well, with that, just a big thank you from everybody, and thank you so much to my partners in crime here, to Barbara, Kathy, Gama, Sada, and Yael. It was fun putting this together, and getting to know y'all better throughout the process, and certainly thanks for the support from ILA and their staff for reaching out to us and saying, hey, I think this would be a great opportunity for a webinar from a proposal we had submitted to the conference that's coming up in a few weeks here. So I hope to see a lot of y'all in West Palm Beach. And just a reminder, this was a webinar as part of the Leadership Perspectives webinar series of the International Leadership Association. So enjoy the rest of your week. And again, thank you to all of our panelists and participants.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.